Vivian Carter stood beside her husband's grave, and she had already signed the papers that would rewrite her children's lives as they knew it. She never raised her voice. She never had to. Nobody in that family had any idea what she'd built or what she was capable of protecting it from. Her children called her sweet behind her back, and they meant it as an insult. They thought sweetness meant she was harmless. They thought harmless meant she was nothing. By the time they understood how wrong they were, their father had already been in the ground for 3 months, and their mother had already moved against every single one of them without a single raised word. This is the story of Vivian Carter, a woman who let the world believe her husband built everything they owned, and the 2 adult children who decided his death was worth more to them than his life. Neither Damon Carter nor his sister Angela Carter knew, on the morning this story truly begins, that the mother they dismissed for 2 decades had quietly built and controlled a fortune 10 times the size of the one bearing their father's name. Neither of them knew that the woman pouring their coffee at Sunday dinner had already watched them plan a murder from a doorway they didn't know she was standing in. By the time this is over, you will understand why sweetness was never the same thing as weakness, and why nobody in that family ever thought to ask what their mother had built long before their father's name was on anything. Before I take you into that kitchen, do one thing for me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. I go through every single one, and I respond personally. Then take a second to subscribe, because there's a moment coming in this story that will change everything you think you understand about who deserves to be underestimated. If you can already feel there's more to this than one family's grief, stay with me, because Vivian's story doesn't start beside that grave. It starts decades earlier, in a small house in Macon, Georgia, with a girl who learned early that quiet people are often the most dangerous ones to underestimate. Vivian Carter was born in Macon, Georgia, in 1959, the second of 5 children raised in a house with 1 bathroom and no air conditioning. Her mother cleaned houses on the west side of town, and her father drove a delivery truck for a bakery that never once let him taste what he carried. Vivian learned early that quiet people were often underestimated, and she learned even earlier that being underestimated could be turned into a weapon if you were patient enough to wait for the right moment to use it. By the time she was 17, she had already taught herself bookkeeping from a library manual, balancing the church's finances better than the 2 accountants the congregation had hired before her. She met Walter Carter at a revival meeting when she was 22. Walter was charming in the way that made rooms go quiet when he walked into them. A man with big plans and bigger opinions about how those plans should be funded. Vivian never told him, not on their wedding day and not for many years after, that the small catering business she started in their garage was quietly becoming something far larger than either of them had imagined. She let him believe the growth of their household came from his construction company. She let him take the credit at church, at family reunions, at every dinner table where success needed a face attached to it. It was easier that way, and for a long time, it was enough for her. By the time their 2 children were grown, Walter Carter's name sat on office buildings and community centers across 3 counties, and almost nobody outside a small circle of lawyers and bankers knew that the trust actually funding those buildings had been built and controlled by Vivian since before her youngest child was born. She had structured it that way on purpose, decades earlier, after watching too many women she loved lose everything the moment a husband's name was the only name on the paperwork. Vivian Carter was not soft. She was patient, and patience, as her children were about to learn, is not the same thing as weakness. To her children, though, she was never any of that. She was the one who cried at every wedding, even strangers' weddings, dabbing her eyes before the vows had even finished. She was the one who kept her mother's recipe box on the kitchen counter, worn soft at the corners, and pulled it out every holiday like it held the only thing she had ever built with her own 2 hands. She was the one who never raised her voice at the dinner table, who let arguments pass over her like weather, who seemed, to 2 children who thought they knew her completely, like a woman with nothing left to prove and nothing left to protect. Damon Carter, the eldest, had inherited his father's charm and none of his father's discipline. By 43, he had cycled through 3 failed businesses, each one funded by his father with the understanding that this would be the last time. Angela Carter, 2 years younger, carried a different kind of hunger, quieter but sharper, the kind that smiled through gritted teeth at every family gathering where her brother got a check and she got a lecture. Both of them had grown up hearing their fathers say no and their mothers say nothing, and both of them had drawn the same conclusion from that silence. They believed their mother had no real say in anything that mattered. It was the first mistake either of them would ever make that could not be undone. The trouble started 18 months before Walter Carter's death, when Damon came to his father with a request for $400,000 to launch a real estate venture that existed mostly on paper. Walter refused, not out of cruelty, but out of a lifetime of watching his son treat money like it replenished itself. The refusal became the center of every family conversation that followed, whispered about in kitchens, argued about in parked cars outside church. Angela, who had her own mounting debts from a lifestyle she was unwilling to shrink, found herself agreeing with her brother more each time the subject came up. Neither of them noticed their mother listening from the next room, saying nothing, filing every word away. What neither Damon nor Angela understood was that their father's refusal was never really his decision to make alone. Walter Carter had grown fiercely protective of the fortune's true source in his later years, not because he wanted to control it, but because Vivian had asked him to help her hold the line their children kept trying to erase. He had agreed to be the wall standing between his children and money that was never his to give away freely. It made him, in the final months of his life, the single obstacle standing between his son and daughter and everything they believed they deserved. That obstacle would not stand much longer. Josephine Banks, known to everyone in the Carter household simply as Miss Jo, had cooked for the family for 22 years. She had learned Walter's blood pressure needs before his own doctor adjusted his prescriptions to match. She had watched both Carter children grow from picky toddlers into the adults, now circling their father's refusal like something wounded. Jo loved this family in the specific, complicated way people love the households that have quietly become their second home. When Damon approached her in the pantry one October evening with a request that made her hands go still over the cutting board, she said no before he had even finished the sentence. It was the answer she meant with her whole heart, and it was an answer that would not be allowed to stand. What followed was not a request repeated more gently. It was a threat delivered with the same charm Damon had inherited from his father, wrapped around information about Joe's undocumented nephew that the family had never been meant to have, and a promise that one phone call could end far more than her job. Angela was the one who found the medical records, the financial statements, every private detail of a woman who had spent 2 decades feeding their family with her own hands. They laid it all out for Joe across a kitchen table, not as a threat exactly, never quite spoken plainly enough to be called a threat, but clear enough that Joe understood exactly what would happen to everyone she loved if she refused a second time. Joe agreed, and she has said since that she has never once forgiven herself for it. Though anyone who has ever had to choose between their own conscience and their family's survival might understand the impossible math she was doing at that kitchen table. The plan was slow by design. A medication interaction here, a dosage inconsistency there, small enough that any single instance would read as an old man's declining health rather than deliberate harm. Walter Carter's decline began so gradually that even his own doctor attributed it to age. Nobody in that house was looking for a crime. Everybody in that house, except for one person nobody suspected, was watching something else entirely unfold. Simone Carter had married into this family 11 years earlier, and in that time, she had learned to read Damon's moods the way sailors read weather. She noticed the change in him months before she understood what it meant, a new tension around his father, private phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered a room, evenings spent with Angela behind closed doors that never used to close. It was an accident, the kind that changes the entire shape of a life, that brought her to the hallway outside the study one November night, close enough to hear her husband and his sister discussing dosages and timelines in voices too low for anyone else in the house to catch. Simone did not sleep that night, or many nights after. She turned the conversation over in her mind so many times that she began to doubt her own memory of it, wondering if grief and stress had simply made her hear something that wasn't there. But small confirmations kept arriving. A pharmacy receipt in Damon's jacket pocket for a medication Walter had never been prescribed. A conversation with Joe in the kitchen that ended too fast, Joe's hands trembling around a mixing bowl she did not need to be holding. Simone was carrying a truth too heavy to hold alone and too dangerous to share with almost anyone in that house. There was exactly one person she eventually trusted enough to tell. She chose Vivian on a Tuesday afternoon in January, cornering her mother-in-law in the laundry room under the pretense of asking about stain removal, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she told her everything she had pieced together. Vivian listened without a single visible flicker of shock crossing her face, and Simone would later say that stillness frightened her more than any reaction of horror could have. Vivian thanked her, asked her to say nothing to anyone, and asked one final question that Simone has never forgotten. She asked whether Simone was prepared to watch what came next without flinching. Simone said yes, not fully understanding yet what she had just agreed to. Walter Carter died on a Thursday morning in March, in the bedroom he had shared with his wife for 39 years, with organ failure listed as the official cause on a death certificate nobody thought to question. His funeral was large, the kind of funeral a respected man's name earns in a town where he built half the buildings people gathered to mourn him inside of. Damon and Angela stood at the front of that church in black suits, accepting condolences with the practiced solemnity of people who had rehearsed grief without ever quite feeling it, already quietly calculating what their father's death would finally allow them to access. In the weeks that followed, Damon moved forward with the real estate venture his father had refused to fund, confident that with Walter gone, his mother would prove exactly as easy to manage as he had always assumed her to be. Angela began making calls about a property in Charlotte she had wanted for years, speaking about her mother's assets in the casual, entitled tone of someone discussing property she had already inherited in every way that mattered to her. Neither of them noticed that Vivian had stopped attending certain meetings she used to sit quietly through. Neither of them noticed the new lawyer's name that had begun appearing on paperwork they never bothered to read closely. They believed they had won something. They believed their father's death had cleared the only obstacle standing between them and the life they felt entitled to. What they did not understand, what nobody outside a small circle of attorneys and one grieving daughter-in-law understood, was that the woman they had spent their whole lives underestimating had already begun quietly moving every piece of real power beyond their reach, months before their father's body was ever placed in the ground. Vivian Carter was not in mourning. Vivian Carter was preparing. Grant Coleman had been Vivian's attorney for 19 years, long before Walter's name appeared on a single building, and he was the only person besides Vivian herself who had always known the truth about where the Carter fortune actually originated. It was Grant who sat across from Vivian in his office 3 weeks after the funeral and told her, gently, that the toxicology consultation she had quietly requested had come back with results that confirmed what she already suspected in her bones. Walter Carter had not simply declined. Walter Carter had been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, over 5 long months, by someone with access to every meal that entered his body. Vivian did not go to the police that afternoon, and she has since explained why in the plainest terms imaginable. She wanted to understand the full shape of what had happened before she decided what justice was even going to mean in this particular case. She summoned Joe Banks to her home alone one evening, and what followed was not the confrontation Joe had spent months dreading. Joe confessed everything, sobbing through an explanation of threats against her nephew, of a choice she had never wanted to make and had spent every day since regretting. Vivian listened to every word, and when Joe finished, Vivian did something Joe says she will never forget for the rest of her life. She took Joe's hands in her own and told her she understood exactly what it meant to be cornered by people who assumed you had no power to refuse them. It was in that same conversation that Vivian finally said the words out loud that she had kept buried for over 3 decades. She told Joe the truth about the trust, about the business she built from a garage catering operation into a financial structure that dwarfed everything bearing her husband's name, about every dollar her children had ever spent without knowing whose money it actually was. Joe Banks was the very first person in the Carter family's orbit to learn that Vivian Carter, the sweet, quiet woman who poured coffee at Sunday dinner, was in fact the real billionaire her children had been circling and disrespecting their entire lives. Damon and Angela still had absolutely no idea. If you're still here with me, thank you for staying this far. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, did you see this coming, or did Vivian surprise you too? What Vivian built over the following 6 months was not revenge in the way her children would later describe it to anyone willing to listen. It was, in Grant Coleman's own words, simply the closing of doors that should never have been opened to people capable of what Damon and Angela had done. Every account they believed they had partial access to was quietly restructured. Every property Angela had begun making calls about in Charlotte was moved into a trust neither she nor her brother had signing authority over. Damon's real estate venture, the one he assumed his father's death had finally cleared the path for, found its funding sources drying up one by one, each rejection arriving through channels too distant and too legitimate looking for either of them to trace back to their own mother. Simone remained inside the family throughout all of it, carrying the full weight of what she knew while sitting across from her husband at dinner tables and holiday gatherings, watching him grow increasingly confused and then increasingly desperate as opportunities he assumed were guaranteed began collapsing around him. She has said since that those months were the hardest of her life, not because she doubted what her mother-in-law was doing, but because loving someone and knowing what they had done are two things that do not cancel each other out, no matter how badly you might wish they would. By late autumn, nearly 8 months after Walter's death, Damon and Angela finally requested a formal meeting with their mother's attorney, confused and increasingly alarmed by how thoroughly their access to family money had evaporated. They walked into Grant Coleman's office that morning still believing they were meeting to resolve a misunderstanding. They had no idea their mother would be sitting at the head of that table, waiting for them, with a folder in front of her containing more than they could have imagined possible. Vivian Carter did not raise her voice that morning, and those who witnessed the meeting have said that was somehow more devastating than shouting could have ever been. She laid out the toxicology findings first, watching her children's faces shift from confusion to something closer to panic as they understood what she was describing. She did not need to say Joe's name for either of them to understand exactly how she knew. What followed was not a courtroom, not a trial in the way either of them might have imagined facing consequences, but something Vivian had decided mattered more to her than a public reckoning ever could. She told them, in a voice Simone later described as almost unbearably calm, that she would not be pursuing criminal charges, not out of forgiveness, but because a public trial would have dragged Joe Banks and her family through exactly the kind of exposure Joe had been threatened with in the first place, and Vivian refused to let that happen to a woman who had already suffered enough for choices that were never truly hers to make freely. Instead, she told her children the truth about who actually controlled every dollar they had ever touched, and she told them, in the same breath, that neither of them would ever touch a cent of it again. Damon reportedly said nothing for nearly a full minute. Angela, by contrast, began pleading almost immediately, invoking their father's memory in a way that Vivian later called the cruelest thing either of her children had ever said to her. Vivian stood, gathered the folder in front of her, and told them both that their father had spent his final year of life trying to protect her from exactly this outcome, and that the smallest thing she could do to honor that was to make certain his death had not been for nothing. She left the room without waiting for a response. In the 2 years since that meeting, Vivian Carter has quietly restructured nearly everything her family once assumed belonged to Walter alone. Neither Damon nor Angela was ever formally charged with a crime. Vivian made that choice deliberately, the same way she made every other choice in this story, to keep Joe Banks and her family out of a courtroom and out of the exposure a trial would have demanded. But the law never touching them was never the same thing as them getting away with anything. Damon lost the real estate venture entirely within a year. Angela sold the home she and her husband had stretched themselves thin to afford, unable to keep up payments without the access she had always assumed would be there. Neither of them speaks to their mother today. Josephine Banks, whose testimony ultimately helped confirm the full timeline of what happened in that house, was never prosecuted and remains, by her own choice, one of the very few people Vivian still speaks with regularly. Simone Carter separated from Damon 8 months after that confrontation, unable to reconcile the man she had built a life with against the man capable of what he had done, though she has said publicly that she does not regret the years she spent protecting the truth until it was finally ready to be told. Vivian Carter still lives in the same house she shared with Walter for nearly 4 decades, and she still, according to people close to her, does not raise her voice. She has begun, in recent months, quietly funding scholarships for young women interested in business and finance, always under a name that is not her own. In the same careful, deliberate way, she once built an entire fortune that nobody thought to ask about. She has said, in one of the only interviews she has ever given about that year, that she does not consider herself a victim of what happened to her family. She considers herself, simply, a woman who was underestimated for exactly as long as she allowed herself to be. If this story moved you even a little, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and I hope Vivian Carter's story stays with you the way it stayed with me.